Hi, I'm Dr. David Dobson. Welcome to Conversations. Today, my guest is Ying Zhou. Ying is a PhD candidate in sustainability management at the University of Waterloo. Her research focuses on understanding how cities navigate institutional, temporal, and place-based complexity in tackling grand challenges of climate change. We will discuss her PhD research today. It's a pleasure to have you on my show, Ying.
Hi, David. Thank you for your invite. I personally think this is a good time for me to reflect on my journey thus far. So really appreciate and looking forward to our conversation.
Ying, what brought your interest to sustainability management?
Well, when I first hear this question, often I resort to, talking about the need for research in sustainability management. But just pausing for a minute, I think it just for me is I come so far in kind of that journey. So reflecting on this journey, what brought me here.
Mm,
So I was given like some time to think about it, and it all started, I guess, back in my undergrad.
mm,
So the think thinking about um what my interests are, and I find I just reflecting, I'm always interested in that interconnectedness between different topics. So
mm,
when I was in my undergrad, I pursue natural sciences, so environmental sciences, where I thought I would end up, doing wetland assessments or
yeah,
environmental assessment in such a way.
yeah,
But upon taking different courses, I was able to kind of come across two courses that kind of changed the course of my, life, but also my research interest. And that those are two management courses at Queen's University. One is on sustainability strategy, and the other is on evaluations and kind of
mm,
reporting
mm,
on sustainability practices.
mm,
Before then, I was taking courses in environmental science and I was taking courses in economics. I feel
mm.
like an outsider in both of the areas where when I was taking environmental science courses, I feel like, oh, um, I'm kind of more of a social science thinker.
Yeah.
But and when I'm taking economics, I'm more like, what about environment considerations? What about these externalities considerations? So that those courses end up kind of management courses kind of brought my thinking together and then
Mm,
shaped what do I want to do. So then, as I was approaching for applying for my graduate studies,
mm,
I came across Dr. Mila Clark's work,
yeah.
and her work is on sustainability at that time, where a
Mm,
lot of her work is on sustainability, strategic planning,
mm,
but with a focus on cities.
yeah.
So that interests me even more because when we think about climate change, when we think about sustainability and all these environmental issues, what typically learned at school is a lot of either very technical at that
Mm,
time, very
mm,
technical, or
yeah.
more on the global level. So when we're looking at the Kyoto Protocol in
Mm,
1997, the
mm,
Paris Agreement on 2015 in
mm,
2015, those are the most attractive kind of
yeah.
um, where for climate and for sustainability work.
Yeah.
But when you're looking down on where does the action happen
Mm,
and where action needs to happen, and it's mainly around local scale, like around
mm,
cities where it kind of that those are action happening.
yeah.
So
Yeah.
and then when we look at um my colleague probably talked about these stats is around, emissions around a city.
Yeah.
70% are in urban areas
Mm,
and municipalities, local government has approximately like over 50% of a control of what they
mm,
can control in terms of emissions.
mm,
So when we think about this, cities are critical in kind of limiting the the global warming effect below the critical 2%,
mm,
2
mm,
degrees under the Paris Agreement.
mm,
And and when you think about the task, global cities need to decline GHG emissions from anywhere between 225 tons of CO2 per year to over 70 megatons to achieve net zero.
Yeah.
So this is very challenging, but at the same time, quite exciting topic.
Yeah.
So, and and I'm excited
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
really to be
Yeah.
part of like
Yeah.
research that could foster this change to kind
Yeah.
of from the existing
Yeah.
rate of GHG emissions toward this net zero commitment
Yeah.
across the globe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, Ying, for your PhD research, you are studying how cities are tackling the grand challenges of climate change, which you also just mentioned a minute ago. Can you share a little bit about your project?
Perfect. Yeah. So my work mainly look at how cities navigate the issues of grand challenges from three areas. So
Hmm.
from my initial literature scan and kind of um, identifying some of the research gap, what I find is that there is really a lack of empirical research on
Hmm.
how various institutional pressures motivates or demotivates the initiation of a net zero commitment among cities. And this is especially in the Canadian context. There's many studies that's happening in the US, a lot more in Europe, but for Canada, we're also it's also need to be looking at. And as a Canadian scholar,
Yeah.
I find this quite important to understand the differences in Canada and the context of Canadian cities
Hmm.
and municipalities.
Hmm.
And what I also find is that there's typically a limited research around
Hmm.
considerations of temporal organizing. So
Hmm.
like the interplay of temporality
Yeah.
on net zero planning initiatives and actions. And these
Hmm.
topics, I mean, it's starting now and
Hmm.
there's once in the past and it kind of gained traction now around roles of temporality
Hmm.
in management works and research, but there is still, a recognized lack of kind of research
Hmm.
on pertaining to that in
Hmm.
relation to
Hmm.
climate, in
Hmm.
relation to net zero.
Hmm.
And lastly, it's just the exam again, building on that examination of not only temporal considerations,
Hmm.
but also the consideration of integration of temporality and place. So all
Hmm.
these topics are really essential to understanding how cities tackle grand challenges because in the end, grand challenges is a very, very complex
Yeah.
topic. And given the nature of these topics, we can't really approach a lot of these questions without thinking about about time, about
Yeah.
place, and about all these different social pressures and
Yeah.
institutional structures.
Yeah.
Um, so, and
Hmm.
but that basically sums up. But what my research kind of hope to look at is so to address some of the gap is to kind of understanding that um, what are so firstly I'm adopting more of a three paper approach to my PhD work. So
Hmm.
first, my research looked at and adopted institutional lens to kind of
Hmm.
explore how regulatory demand, social norms, and cultural expectations influence organizational response to net zero pressure. So in
Hmm.
this case, organization of local governmental public sector organizations.
Hmm.
And specifically, I aim at understanding why some organizations respond more proactively to these pressures, where others kind of have delayed actions or
Hmm.
non-adoptance
Hmm.
of these um, specifically these net zero target goals.
Yeah.
And then looking on to more temporal and place-based analysis,
Hmm.
my work kind of examines the role of time
Hmm.
and temporary organizing in cities as they transition toward net zero emissions. So
Yes.
there I focus on looking at partnerships, but
Hmm.
temporary
Hmm.
partnerships to explore explore kind of how these short-term arrangements enable or constrain municipal effort to achieve decarbonization goals. And
Yeah.
and then building on that, but looking at a different level, I look at the interplay of temporality in cities. So looking at how um, particularly how cities plan and narrate and organize around temporal and place dimensions.
Mhm.
So balancing, immediate challenges, past climate action, future visions as they make progress in planning for these net zero targets, and looking at how does they view cities alongside cities in terms of place alongside time.
Mm.
So that basically sums up kind of like the sequence, the flow, and then a little sneak peek into some of the papers that I
Yeah.
will be, maybe soon coming out
Yeah.
to
Yeah. 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 Okay.
for this paper, one of them is going into a special issue submission,
Okay.
so
Okay.
hopefully the successful ones soon. So I
Okay.
published some of the side papers and working on side papers, so that's not really
Okay.
part of my research, but
Okay.
related to net zero. But
Okay.
hoping to have these out um that I presented at conferences, so some
Soon.
of them might, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. For sure.
soon,
I just,
hopefully.
yeah, for sure. Yes. Yes. And all the best. Uh, Ying, I'm amazed with your research topic. It's a very good research topic, and this is great. The three gaps you identified is also very good. I'm just wondering, for PhD student, the biggest hurdle is to finding up your project topic and then identifying those gaps so you can go do research on those gaps. Just for your own experience, how did you go about really researching your topic and then identifying the gap?
Well, I think from I thinking about it. So, when I did my master's, I
Mm,
focused a lot on, sustainability planning among cities. So I had wonderful conversations with municipalities as they were
mm,
kind of planning
okay.
for sustainability work
Mm,
among their municipalities. And part
mm,
of that work is kind of linking my bit of my economics background in looking at market-based instruments and how they can help cities implement some of their SDG
okay.
related
Mhm,
goals that's outlined in their plans. But I mean, given the context of shifting priorities in Canada, we have to come to a realization that,
mm,
you know, sustainability important
mhm,
research, but a lot of this work is quite, I mean, from a municipal context, the meaning of such is quite um, open to
mm,
interpretation based on different municipalities. So what they think about sustainability and what they're working on. So it became a challenge for a challenge to kind of having um, position sustainability to their residents or the priority of sustainability.
mm,
And also at that in Canada has, as climate change and the IPCC report and all this work around climate change has become more prominent,
mm,
Canada also had made the commitment to net zero.
mm,
So this shifted a lot of the work at the municipal level, although a lot of these work when I was looking at their plans
mm,
still have this essence of sustainability thinking at all
mm,
these built upon efforts
mm,
from their previous sustainability work. But now the language and a lot of the work is around climate. So
mm,
with consideration of with
mm,
consideration of social justice and equity. So
mm,
those are the social
mm,
elements in sustainability planning. But the core central kind of priority and topic among municipalities now are climate change and transitioning to net
mm,
zero. And we can
mm,
see that from the hundreds of Canadian municipalities that pledged
mm,
the climate emergency. I think
mm,
it's just this topic has become more. concrete and tangible. Like
Yeah.
climate change is always a more concrete kind of topic that, well, although there are deniers, and that's another story, but
Mm,
it's often easier to kind of tackle on the sense that um they know what to the means to end sometimes, where sustainability seems more as that journey and progress to
mm,
strive to for something that is, you know, lasting.
yeah.
Uh, so it's just then this kind of become my bigger topic is that I want to look at that net zero transition
Mm,
among cities.
mm,
But what also brought me to kind of looking at the temporal and the place
mm,
aspect is that when I was looking through the conversations, it's just kind of I mean, I don't want to say it popped in my head. It kind of got me curious. It's the
yeah.
nature of climate change and
Yeah.
grand challenges is that
Yeah.
it's always a system
Mm,
and complexity. And when
yeah.
we talk about cities, although like they're mainly in Canada, the case a lot of the cases is that local government, so as local government, public
Yeah.
sector organizations
Yeah.
lead a lot of this, is that it's a lot of complexity around
Mm,
um, the ecological considerations that we would kind of term it, and the
yeah.
temporal considerations,
Yeah.
and how would that fit when we think about management strategic planning work.
Yeah.
So that kind of brought about
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
how I narrow
Yeah.
it down in terms,
Yeah.
it's just curiosity. I feel a
Yeah.
lot of the research is like, it
Yeah.
makes you curious about what if, like, what
Yeah.
does this mean? And
Yeah.
then it propels me to go forward and kind of explore that through
Mm,
like data collection
mm,
and through kind of analysis in a
yeah.
way.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing your journey here. Um, for your project, can you tell how you are conducting your research?
Yeah, of course. So for for my PhD, I connected all my analysis are done using qualitative
Mm,
research method.
mhm,
So multi-case design. So kind
mm,
of I use multi-case designs
mm,
to answer these research questions. So from if I recall, uh, I did data collection from 2020 in
mm,
2020, and this is mainly because we leverage, I mean, thanks to
mm,
my supervisor, we
mm,
leveraged our previous relationship and collaboration with a Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and that at that time they had an initiative, a Transition 2050 initiative. So it's a partnership kind of a initiative involving NGOs and municipalities across Canada. So these partnership range from 5 to 12 municipality per NGO, and the main purpose of this initiative is to kind of address different diverse challenges that align with the Canada's 2050 net zero goals. So, and then this initiative um, focused a lot on um, supported decarbonization efforts,
mm,
strategic climate change planning, and kind of some of the innovative approach to addressing
mm,
how cities would transition toward net zero. So this essentially is a perfect opportunity to collect my data to
mm,
understand, in depth um, how cities and transition, were attempts to transition and navigate the nuances of decarbonization. So this led to 51 in-depth interviews with
mm,
municipal staffs and
mm,
officials, and
mm.
12 interviews with the NGO representative. So these
Okay.
NGOs are national and regional-wide NGOs
Okay.
that kind of support climate action
Mm,
of cities. So they play that supporting and peripheral role of how helping cities transition to 20 net zero and a lot of their climate mitigation initiatives. And these interviews,
Mm.
because the nature of
Yeah.
my interest to study
Yeah.
in Canadian municipalities.
Yeah.
So this really kind of built that rich data set
Yeah.
for to support my analysis
Yeah.
of the data to answer the three research questions that I'm curious about. And also many of these municipalities are across Canada. So the interviews were conducted in both English and French as well.
Oh,
And
nice.
when I say in depth, many of these interviews are approximately like 45 to 60 minutes long, very kind of exploring different topics around their climate mitigation and decarbonization
Mm.
efforts.
Mm.
So, and then I guess an interesting stat is that,
Yeah.
the range of
Mm.
municipalities I interviewed kind of range from 500 to over 2.9 million. And that kind of
Yeah.
just give a snapshot about um, how diverse Canadian municipalities are in terms of population size. And that we have like over 5,000 municipalities, but like over 4,500 of them are like with municipalities less than 5,000. So we have representations from very, very small um, municipalities
Mm.
to mega cities in terms of
Mm.
Canadian context.
Yeah.
And in terms of, I think moving on to a bit of data analysis. So I use mainly a thematic analysis
Yeah.
to to kind of answer and explore these questions. But I use different case kind of boundaries and case it varies by paper.
Mm.
So when I was looking at um, demotivating and motivating uh, institutional pressures. So those are like more organizational level focus. And so I looked at mainly interviews from these 51 cities. So looking at my findings from analyzing on the city level and
Yeah.
these specifically the 51 cases. And my second paper looked at temporary organizing and but looking at temporary partnerships. So
Mm.
again, this thanks to the data set and the kind
Yeah.
of the nature of this data is
Yeah.
that I'm able to look at partnership level. So
Yeah.
looking at instead of looking at cities separately and NGO separately, my case is bounded by these partnership between NGOs and cities. So in total, there are 12 cases. So, and then I looked at kind of data grouped by of these NGOs and their partnership with these cities.
Yeah.
And lastly, I looked at planning and the consideration of temporality and place in net zero and climate mitigation planning, and then I went back to kind of looking at the different 51 cases, but specifically this time I looked at their plans. So I mainly look at what is being portrayed in their plans, what is being narrated in their plans, and how they envision um, how, how this time and place is
Yeah.
coming out of their narrative of their climate plan and decarbonization
Yeah.
actions. So
Nice.
that is basically kind of a highlight overview about
Yeah.
data collection and analysis
Yeah.
of my PhD
Yeah. Well, I
work.
mean, you have a huge data collection. I mean, interviewing over 60 interviews, it's a very large sample, and from 45 to 1 hour. So it's a lot of time you invested doing these interviews. I'm just wondering, you talk about small municipalities and a larger municipality. Did you find some sort of common theme between these, talking to these municipalities, or there's like they're entire different issues for depending upon where they're located?
Surprisingly, there is a it's quite consistent. I mean,
Oh,
in
okay.
terms of their
Mm,
commitment to
okay.
climate action and
Okay.
they're thinking about the needs of climate action planning and some of the initiatives that they're working on. I mean, just by I mean, I could go and kind of
Yeah.
talk to
Yeah.
Canadian municipalities that are random, but what I was really curious
Mm,
is it is the criteria that they're committed. So
mm,
by being in this kind of initiative, they
mm,
they are they're committing themselves into kind of into having putting efforts
yeah.
to transition or at least
Yeah.
um climate mitigation efforts
Mm,
to advance their climate, goals and
mm,
commitments. So,
yeah.
so there are across Canada, I think
Mm,
uh, Canadian municipalities are progressing and doing a lot more than we give them efforts for it. I
oh,
feel like
yeah.
and it's not being studied
Yeah.
enough. I
Yeah.
feel
For
we
sure.
always look at again states
Yeah.
as and um,
Mm,
and Europe as kind of the center for data collections
mm,
of and I feel like as Canadian scholars,
yeah.
um, this is valuable, kind of
Yeah.
understanding the Canadian data in
Yeah.
context.
Mm, yeah. Because I was thinking, larger municipalities, they probably have more way to generate more taxes revenue for the cities, where the small municipalities, they may not have less resources to generate
Yes,
taxes.
so
So that might has affect some of the initiative they want to bring to the cities.
yeah, I mean, if you think about that way, yeah, there are some differences, but when you think broader in terms
Yeah.
of, I
Yeah.
mean, the differences come through from when I look at my first looking at pressures a little
Yeah.
bit,
Yeah.
but resources in terms of, but when we think about another way that
Hmm.
large municipalities need these resources to make some progress, whereas
Yeah.
small municipalities only requires, maybe
Yeah. Yeah.
a lot less to make the progress in their
Mm,
municipalities. And that
yeah.
came through, I mean, specifically for one for the one of the small municipalities is that, a lot of their energy emissions come
Yeah.
from their corporate
Yeah.
work
Yeah.
and setting and by securing their corporate actions,
Yeah.
they're able to tackle a lot of their community emissions. And that
Yeah.
would not be the case in large cities. And
Yeah.
there's a lot more nuances and challenges that would
Yeah.
require more
Yeah.
resources to
Yeah.
tackle. So I
Yeah.
think it comes into balance.
Yeah. I'm also, thank you for sharing this. I'm also wondering, when you're talking to this in your interviews, in-depth interviews, did they share some of the challenges why they were not, like, this is their thinking, they have in plan, why they are not able to achieve some of the target they set out, or they are on the way to achieving the target of net zero?
So it's in my data set, and I haven't really
Okay.
thinking.
Okay.
Well, let me put it this: I did ask them a question
Yeah.
about progress and
Mm,
their thoughts about
mm, mm,
achieving such goals,
mm.
and but it's not. I mean, it's currently not in any of my analysis data
For
because
sure.
the fit
Yeah.
with the question.
Yeah.
But just to satisfy your curiosity, I think they are uncertain.
Okay.
And this comes a lot of with that although municipality have control, and you
Mm,
can see that from when I kind of share a little bit about findings of my first paper while
yeah.
it's on pressures, is that
Mm,
they like you mentioned, they have limited resources, and given the nature of municipalities in Canada,
mm,
they they don't have a lot of direct control
mm,
over some of their ambitious,
mm.
efforts. They're
Yeah.
navigating around it, but
Sure.
it requires
Yeah.
the province
Mm,
to kind of support a lot of these actions. And
mm.
currently, hopefully in the future, but
Yeah.
currently there is some barriers in some of the provinces.
Yeah.
Um, but but there are a lot of innovative efforts
Mm,
they're doing. They're mainly, I guess, came from my paper too, is that I'm looking at partnerships, and a lot of them are um, again temporary at the
Mm,
municipal level, and they're starting to kind of integrate it into the system, but it has to start out temporary given like the risk averse natures of
yeah.
municipalities and their decision making. So we're getting there. And thirdly is that market, right? Technology and market. A lot of these pathways where cities have kind of planned their pathways requires a lot of innovation from the tech side as well. So
Mm,
even with kind of removing and having policies to support that these these more like innovation has to be, a lot
mm,
more widely adopted
yeah.
to generate effects. And when we talk about climate-wide emissions reductions, a significant portion of emissions are transportation, right?
Mm,
Transportation,
yeah.
and there's only limited like direct control that city can do in terms of transportation, then
Mm,
kind of supporting active transportation,
mm,
transit and
yeah.
public transit planning. But at the end of the day, and support EV structures, that's what a lot of these cities are doing as
Mm,
well.
mm,
But at the end of the day, is that you need people to actually adopt
mm,
and like switch to EV, switch to public
yeah.
transit.
Yeah.
And that is sometimes beyond
Challenging.
direct control of
Yeah.
of
Cities.
municipalities, and that takes technical advancement in terms of um like bring the prices down of a mass
Yeah. Mm,
production of
yeah.
electric vehicles so
Yeah.
that it's affordable across
Yeah.
populations, but
Yeah.
also that mind change that
Yeah.
like
Yeah. It takes time for sure. Uh,
yeah.
I was just wondering because now we have several municipality for sure, and different shapes and different size.
Mhm.
And in order to measure their progress to achieving, let's say, the net zero target, is there some sort of measurement or a scale are out there which they can kind of say, okay, this is what we did, checkbox, or this is how we assign some sort of metrics?
So each municipality, I mean, depending on the municipality, of
Yeah.
course, but they have the plan around
Okay.
transitioning to net zero. And
Okay.
often you find in these plans, they kind of map out if we
Okay.
want to then this is done on a national scale, right? For Canada
Yeah.
as well. If
Yeah.
we want to get to net zero by 2050, or what would this trajectory look like? And so that
Mm,
backcasting approach in terms of what we need to consider now so that we can get to the net zero. But again, along the way, there's a lot of, speculation. So like I'm just saying hypothetically, not kind of alluding to any municipality, but like during these passes, there might be like wide adoption of electric vehicles so
mm,
that, the
mm,
transportation emissions can decrease by
mm.
40% by 2030
Yeah.
or 2035. But
Yeah.
so there are a lot of kind of speculations about what's coming in the future that could to help um drive the emissions down. And that is
Mm,
mainly around community level emissions. But if we look at corporate level, which
mm,
which in the cases is organizational
mm,
level kind of emission reduction, a lot of them are on targets.
mm,
And a lot of them have quite an ambitious target. And these are just, corporate operations and services that they can have direct control and influence over. So, and then works around procurement, sustainable procurement is
mm,
already being kind of recognized, and that is being slowly kind of built into different municipalities as a more long-term kind of solution and kind of one of the transition toward um, to propel their actions. But
mm,
at the corporate level emissions, yeah, they I mean, they're hitting a lot more on its targets because of
mm,
that direct control and
mm,
influence on their operations
mm,
versus community. But
mm.
again, they're working
Yeah.
working hard
Yeah. For
on
sure.
on
Yeah.
community levels.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah.
it's just
Lot.
it's just again,
Yeah.
it's a system wide
Yeah. Yeah.
challenge, and
Yeah.
their cities are
Yeah.
critical
Yeah.
players, but they're
Mm,
just one of the critical player that
yeah.
kind of
Yeah. Yeah.
influence actions.
For sure. It's not a quick fix. It's a long-term commitment and
Exactly.
ongoing progress, ongoing work. Ying, thank you for sharing your interviews and your data collection process and design of your data. Uh, what did you learn from your data?
So my first question, I mean,
Mm,
first paper kind of look at different how different institutional pressure influence the adoption of science-based targets for net zero transition. So what I mean what I learned from there and from our previous conversations around challenges and is that there's definitely uh in the Canadian context there's a high uh influence of coercive pressure. So that
mm,
mainly come from provincial support and mandate on climate change
mm,
and the adoption of these net zero science-based targets among
mm,
municipalities.
mm,
So we can see that from the interview, um, when these municipalities are in these provinces where the province have mandate or have high levels of support, that the municipalities all adopted, science-based targets in as kind of the target for their net zero and the goal for their net zero transition efforts. Whereas when there is a lack or moderate, I mean, instead of a moderate or limited kind of coercive pressure in play, other pressures kind of comes in to influence the adoption of science-based targets. And
mm,
those are normative pressures in forms of participation from transnational climate networks and also, commitment from the municipality itself on net zero and climate actions.
mm,
So and then so when those normative pressures are present and enough, that then it leads to municipality kind of adopt science-based targets. And when we look at when there is a lack of normative pressure, especially normative pressure and mimetic pressure in terms of municipal leadership, um, when there is a lack or resistance of leadership, there's typically leads to non-action in terms of target adoption. Um, so, I mean, in summary, like in the case of Canada, coercive pressure definitely plays a lot more impacts and influence than what we would like to believe. I mean, given that municipalities are subject of province in most cases.
mm.
So, but but luckily, like when coercive pressure is not present, when the other type of pressures come in and then can still propel and influence municipality to make these um and adopt science-based target and make these commitments.
Yeah, neat. So, Ying, what do you hope to contribute through your research?
Well, I hope to kind of contribute to my work on three different levels where I just mentioned it's just one of like the findings from my paper.
Yeah.
Um, and that is more on organizational level. So I looked
Mm,
kind of to use and like use the institutional lens and I examined how different institutional pressure influence the initiation of net zero commitment in Canadian cities and kind of hope that this research provides more insights into mechanisms to
mm,
understand um, how what drives and what hinders organizational climate strategies or commitment or goal adoption in addressing the critical gap in the Canadian context. And where my other two um, papers, well, I guess it's,
yeah.
it's to
Yeah.
expect in the future when it
Yeah.
comes out. It's looking more at contribution on the partnership level. So in
Mm,
terms of temporary organizing,
mm,
I look to kind of I, I looked at the roles of time-limited partnerships in advancing net zero initiatives, and then look at how short-term partnerships enable and constrain municipal effort to tackle grand challenges like decarbonization. So, in short, what I found is that um, like these temporary partnerships require less drivers for formation. So that could be a catalyst for municipalities to take on more ambitious climate action efforts. So and kind of hope um, that these temporary partnerships can kind of drive municipalities to adopt a more experiment and adopt
Mhm.
a more I guess again like ambitious efforts and then maybe to more permanent forms of partnership formation. And lastly is that my last paper is more focusing on field level, so looking at cities
Yeah,
as field level.
yeah.
So in there I kind of aim to investigate the role of temporality and place
Mm,
in climate and net zero planning. So look at how municipalities and its regional actors and construct these temporal narratives and place narratives to balance short-term actions with long-term visions and kind of look at how the role of time and place come into play when they shape their future visions of net zero cities
yes,
and understanding how that come into play in terms of field level analysis.
great. Ying, what is your advice for future researchers who wish to study this topic?
My advice is to find a piece of this, given that the grand challenges, this it's very complex and interconnected, and it's
Yeah,
kind of systems intertwined. I just
yes,
feel like don't overwhelm,
yeah,
but find an interesting piece
yeah,
in this topic because you'll always find one. I mean,
yeah.
many scholars look at climate change, looking at sustainability, but
Yeah.
we'll always find a piece that's interesting to us. And a lot of my research is driven by curiosity, is driving
Mm,
like that sparks why,
yeah.
how. So I think that is when you find those questions through your data and through kind of when you read other people's work, it will
Mm,
drive it will drive your own research. I think that is interesting and that is what's exciting about a PhD research
yeah.
and in research in general.
It's never been a boring moment.
Yes.
Thank you for this advice. So, Ying, what is next for you?
So I'm hoping
Yeah.
to wrap up my and defense soon. That's my immediate kind of
Uh-huh.
goals.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm looking to be on the job market next year. So
Mm,
um to start my preparing, I mean polishing my all my packages. So that is a work on its own. But also I'm part of the climate net oh, I butchered this, but the Net Zero Climate Action Partnership,
mm,
um, which is, I think some of my colleagues mentioned, is a lot more closely tied with their research, but
okay.
it's a I'm part of it as a side project because it is related to climate and
Yeah.
decarbonization and net zero transition in cities. So I'm kind of stay affiliated with parts of that work, um, and yeah, so I'm quite
Wonderful.
excited about what's expected to come along. Hopefully.
Thank you for joining me today to discuss your work, Ying. I wish you all the best in completing your PhD.
Thank you. Thank you for reaching out and this gave me again a wonderful opportunity just to reflect on my journey during I mean that led up to my PhD and also all the work kind of that come into fruition through my PhD journey. So I appreciate I appreciate you listening to